that he cannot make decisions, then you have to tell the wife. Okay. The third one, which constitutes of 40% of patient, is where patient does not bring the spouse at all. Okay. And we do not have any mechanism to go back to his family and trace and bring about this. The minute you do this, the patient will stop coming for this thing. This is an ethical dilemma that we face day in and day out. Okay. And Australian court held a failure of counseling when the patient underwent a marriage, even when he was HIV positive, knew about it, and its negligence and avoided damages. Okay. Now, this is a question: can a patient deliberately infect another person be punished? There is a Indian Penal Code 270 which says any malignant act likely to spread infectious disease dangerous to life. Whoever malignantly does any act which is and which he knows or has reason to believe likely to spread the infection of any disease dangerous to life shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend up to 2 years, or with a fine, or with both. Okay. So, there is a provision, it needs to be applied. The first place that is going to happen is that in Bombay, where 2 of the HIV infected wives have sued their husbands, I mean given police complaints to the husband, but the court has not yet decided what is going to happen in it. Can a doctor be sued or punished for not informing? The thing is, in section 269 of the Indian Penal Code says that when you have negligent act likely to spread infectious disease, and if you do not do that, you can get 6 months imprisonment or fine, or both. So, it all requires a police officer to catch a doctor and say you have not informed HIV and take a case, then he will have a case to come up with. Okay. Now, we come to a question of research. Now, when you talk about research, there are different research that takes place in context to HIV. One is the social sciences research, which I will just touch with. Much more important for as a medical person and clinical ethics is research that involves drugs, research that involves vaccines and microbicides. When we talk about research allocation, usually we have 2 groups. One group gets the active drug, another group gets an inactive drug. Now, the question is, after the treatment is over, should the patients know which group they belong to, whether they were in the treatment group or they were in the allocation group, and usually they have a moral right to know about that, though we do not do that. A study in BMJ showed that 50% of participants receiving placebo are informed about their treatment allocation. Okay. Then post trial intervention is very important. See, the reason why we talk about post trial intervention is, like I will give an example. If a patient is in stroke and you give the patient a drug, like you give him an anticoagulant. Okay. As long as the period of treatment is there with an anticoagulant, patient on the test drug, the company will pay for it. The minute the trial is over, we can always shift to a different anticoagulant and the patient will not suffer from it. Okay. But it is not so with HIV medication. If you start on an antiretroviral drug, you just cannot switch from one to another. He has to continue for it. So, there is a big question is what happens post trial in to the patients that happen in that. Okay. And usually most of the trials that take place nowadays make a provision for the participants to receive the drugs as long as the drug is not available in the market. But once it is available in the market, the patient may not be able to afford to buy that. So, this is a dilemma which the researchers have to face day in and day out when you do with trials with HIV drugs. Now, the other thing that happens is paradoxical reactions. Okay. Now, what happens is you have monitoring of the drug as results every 6 months or 1 year, depending upon the sample size and the type of study that you do. And whenever you find that the treatment arm does much better than the control arm, you stop the control arm and convert the whole trial into treatment arm, and treatment becomes the standard of care. Like for example, Zidovudine, when it was used in prevention of mother to child transmission in 1994, it was so effective they stopped it. But that Zidovudine was starting from 16th week of pregnancy up to delivery time. You give IV Zidovudine and then you give 6 weeks for the baby, which was a huge amount of money. Okay, because it was so good, they stopped the trial. Then we had to find out whether shorter courses of Zidovudine prevent the transmission of mother to child, and this brought about it. Similarly, if you have adverse reactions taking place, which we will totally miss because we do not know whether it is because of the drug or because of the natural course of the disease, because the control arm is lost in this. And there is an ethical responsibility to see that drugs that the affected patients get are also given into the community. Okay, this is an important thing, and usually it is difficult to apply it. And usually, who should provide the intervention? This is another big problem. See, as long as the drug trial is there, the person who is responsible for the drug, whether the drug company or the researcher, will be responsible. After that, what happens? And ultimately, the whole burden of providing the treatment will fall on to the healthcare systems to support it. Okay. So, when as researchers, when we talk about this or sitting in IRB, this is a question that you should always ask whenever a drug trial comes, especially with HIV medications. What is going to happen after the drug trial gets over? Because you cannot just shift drugs from one class to another class in HIV treatment. Okay. Residual damages interventions, usually there is a built-in mechanism in the protocol to take care of them. So, that is not something that we talk about. Then when the trial is over, what happens? This is much more relevant in underdeveloped or developing nations. You may have a sophisticated equipment, it will be operated by someone else, and when that person goes off, nobody will know how to use it, or the reagents may not be available. So, as IRBs, we must look into it, what happens to this equipment when the trial gets over. Now, vaccine trials is another important area, and we have 2 trials going on in India about vaccines, and usually patients may develop antibodies to the virus, and this is detected by ELISA. So, if that person does not reveal that he has been in a vaccine trial, he will be falsely accused of being HIV positive, and they may have other problems because of this HIV thing. And these issues must be discussed with the participants as part of informed consent. Those who develop antibodies can be given a slip which says that they have participated in this trial, and that is why their antibodies are positive. Okay. Now, the other problem that happens is phase 1 trials is okay. When it comes to phase 2 trials, there are much more ethical dilemmas that arise. You require a group of people who are sexually active, who have multiple sex partners, who will not use condoms, on whom you will give the vaccine to see what is the effect. That is the scientific way of doing it. Now, the ethical question is, how can you counsel a person, say, okay, you take this vaccine, you go about having multiple sex partners, there is always a risk, but we know this vaccine may protect you. These are ethical dilemmas that arise when we deal with the vaccine trials. Now, other thing that happens is unlinked anonymous testing that goes on for community surveys. In our country, the way the HIV statistics is collected is by doing unlinked anonymous surveys, which starts from the month of August till month of October. Every blood sample that is tested by antenatal mothers in the government hospitals, a sample is tested for HIV, and that is how we project the HIV figures for it. STD clinics, high risk behavior clinics are STD clinics, truck drivers are this thing, and sex workers. Low risk is antenatal mothers. From this computation of this, the figures are raised for the country to see what is the prevalence rates that happen with HIV. Now, the ethical issue is, if you find somebody is positive there, don't we have a duty to inform that person? No. And here the way the ethicists escape from this question is, we are not worried about the individual, we are worried about the burden in the community. So, the benefits of knowing what is the prevalence in the community gets translated, and because there is more intervention, because there is a high prevalence state, those people will come to for testing. It is a circular argument that is given for unlinked anonymous testing that goes on. Next point that you would like to talk about is, whenever we deal with it, we must deal not only with our mind, but with our hearts also. When you sit in IRB boards, remember, when there is an ethical trial that comes, it is not only the scientific rigor, you have to take into account the social and the other implications that go with the trial. Okay. Now, we come to some of the prevention problems that we have. Okay. Is it a crime to do sex work? Okay. Indian Penal Code says it is not a crime to do sex work. The crime is that you solicit for sex. Okay, if you come in a house, if you have sex and you get paid for it, it's not a crime. But you stand on the street corner, attract clients to come to have sex with you, it becomes a crime. Okay, if a place is used as a brothel, it becomes a crime. Okay, sex work is not condemned, but the things that go with sex work is condemned by the Indian Penal Code, and that is why people want to decriminalize it and make it by modifying the Prevention of Immoral Traffic Act. Okay, and it's in the draft stage, and the sex workers are protesting against it because it will cut directly into their livelihood. Okay, now it is this thing. And when we talk about sex work, you have different categories of sex work that goes on. This is based on studies from Tamil Nadu. You have brothel based, you have home based, part time, street based, call girls, and women work in variety of locations and have different levels of independence or restrictions accordingly. Sex workers reported that they see on an average 3 clients a day, although some studies say that they have 10 to 12 clients per day. Okay, so the truth is somewhere in between this. Okay, the point that is this thing is clients of the sex workers, you will see that it's quite a huge amount. 29% of men have paid for sex at some part of point in time in their lifetime. One common feature observed that is the study says that men often go to sex workers in groups. Okay, and this happens especially because Bangalore gets quite a lot of people come from Andhra and from Tamil Nadu. It's very prevalent in Andhra Pradesh, where groups of people before marriage go with the groom to have sex. Here what happens is, the problem comes is in the sex work, and the ethical thing that we talk about is, if you remember, United States for all its HIV funding makes it mandatory that there will be anti-prostitution, anti-trafficking pledge will be taken by the organizations. Okay, but in reality what has happened is, whenever we have empowered the women sex workers to unionize, to fight for their rights, then the incidence of HIV comes down and the incidence of safe sex increases in the community. Okay, then when you talk about men having sex with men, this again from Tamil Nadu data, where 2% of factory workers, 5% of truckers and 12% of young men in slums have this thing. And the important thing that they have found is, as compared to the West, is many of these men having sex with men are married. They meet the sex partners in covert and discreet surroundings, and IPC makes this a crime. Indian Penal Code, Article 377 makes this a crime. We will talk about it when we talk about the cases that are present on that. Now, mandatory pre-employment screening for armed forces is done because the reasons that I have given us, they are in a very important position. They have to be fit all the time. They cannot come back and say that I am sick, I cannot go. They should be ready to deploy at any time. That is one reason. And second thing is, in a battlefield condition, many of the soldiers go and donate blood, and there is not time for checking for HIV status at that time. That is why they make it mandatory in the armed forces before the patients are taken up for, before the persons are taken into the army. Okay. Now, intravenous drug abusers, we have de-addiction centers, needle syringe exchange programs, and oral substitution maintenance by drugs can be used. Do these programs contravene legal provisions and drug treaties? So, if you have an intravenous drug abuser, will you go and complain to the police? No, these are ethical issues that you have to handle because you are dealing with this. Similarly, if you have a needle exchange program, it means you know that this person is committing a crime, you are helping him to commit a crime in a better way by providing needle exchange programs. And because of these reasons, United States does not have a needle exchange program. Okay. But the UNAIDS says helping IV drug users with needle exchange programs is consistent with the international treaties that are there for helping and prevention of intravenous drug users. Okay. Now, we come to another important is, condom promotion lead to increased sexual activity. This is a question that is being debated in the parliament. Sex education is creating increased sexual activity, but studies show that sexual education or condom promotion does not increase sexual activity, and on sex workers even with explicit information does not increase sexual activity. What studies have shown is in casual sex using a condom as socially acceptable, enjoyable and safe might increase sexual risk behavior in people. Okay. So, there is always a chance that people may be complacent saying that they have used condoms, so they need not be infected. Similarly, when we talk about the individual, using condoms also gives lot of problems for them. It is a visible thing, there is lack of trust between the couple, interrupts a spontaneous act, makes sex an impersonal act, acts as a barrier to spontaneity. Now, I will come to the court cases. Okay, now the court cases are divided, I have divided the court cases into different things. One is in relation to blood safety, this is medical negligence. The case was, first case that came about was in 2000 in Calcutta, where a woman was given contaminated blood and she turned out to be HIV positive, and the court gave her a compensation of 10 lakhs, provided her a job in Calcutta and took care of her treatment. The Indian Navy had to take care of it. The second one was from Tamil Nadu, where a blood bank gave a unit of blood and that blood was transfused without testing onto the patient, and the patient was offered 4 lakhs as compensation with interest by the Supreme Court. The second group of cases are in relation to confidentiality.